This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 12, Going Diceless. Hello friends and welcome to another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody, have you seen my dice?
I stole them from you because today we're talking about going diceless.
Oh.
Believe it or not, in tabletop RPGs, they don't all use dice.
That's crazy
There are some games that don't use dice. And actually, we alluded to in a previous episode, sometimes there are story games that aren't what we'd consider to be role-playing games, even though they have some similarities and et cetera, et cetera. And those oftentimes are diceless. But there actually are some role-playing games that are also diceless.
Yes.
And actually, there's some old ones, too. I'm drawing a blank on the one that I'm thinking of.
Amber Diceless?
Amber, yep, that's the one. That one's
read
been
your
around
mind.
that was mentioned in that history of tabletop role-playing games class.
Of course. Yeah, that's a classic. You can't not talk about Amber. But the truth is, I think that there's a case to be made for a number of systems which are diced as a maybe slight tweak or slight variant where you play it diceless. Mm-hmm. Number one on my list for that actually is Burning Wheel. Mm-hmm. I have played Burning Wheel as a diceless game before. It's based entirely on stats. And because it is a robust system, which is based on life paths and other things, you can basically just ask a series of questions in the moment and say, okay, so what's your attack skill or what's your axe skill or whatever it is? And it's a 4. Okay, then you go ahead and you beat him. Describe that to me.
Right.
And it's then able to be modified by what's called Artha within that system. And normally you'd buy more dice, but in this case, you could just buy successes and other things. There's other ways to do it with slight tweaks. Mm-hmm. So to me, I think that there's got to be a reason to go diceless.
Right. And I think that, if you look at Amber, just as an example, and I forget off the top of my head whether Amber, because I've never actually played it. I think I read a bit about it a few years back, like back when I was an undergrad and first getting into RPGs.
Many years ago.
Where my understanding is that essentially there's an obstacle, and if your skill is high enough to be, at or above that obstacle, do you succeed? If it's lower than the obstacle, you don't succeed. And so in that sense, it's a little bit more deterministic than you might have if you had a dice-based system. We talked in our last episode about dice and those mechanics and what they do to a game. If you want to make something impossible for someone, you just sort of put the obstacle beyond the reach of their dice.
Right.
But if the system is designed so there's always a chance of success, then you're able to sort of say, okay, we're going to have to roll here to see whether or not you do succeed. This just kind of like streamlines the process, if you will, of making something impossible for someone.
That's a good way to say it.
And I think that kind of leads into we wrote down 2 points here of kind of like, to our mind, kind of what are the reasons to go diceless? Mm-hmm. And one, I think, is to speed up the gameplay process. It's to, you can make a diceless system that actually requires a little bit more kind of processing things. Like your example with Burning Wheel is asking that series of questions. And, maybe it's just 2 questions in this case. Maybe we ask like a whole bunch of questions. And that reminds me actually a little bit of just kind of like role playing to determine what happens, which is to say, here's how I'm doing this thing. And the GM just saying, you know what? That's a great strategy. That would succeed.
Right.
Versus saying like, oh, no, that wouldn't succeed. At that point, maybe you do roll the dice. Or if it's a diceless system, you just say, no, that wouldn't work.
Well, it's just like the rule of dice. Whenever you would roll to check and see if something fails, you narrate until something might not succeed. And then you go, time to check stats. Mm-hmm. And it's basically the same thing. You're checking outcomes, but it's a little bit different. So I'm the type of GM who doesn't like to memorize my character's stats, my player's stats, I should say. I think that steals a little bit of fun from it if I'm gaming towards that. Mm-hmm. However, there's an argument to be made on the flip side, which is if you don't build the challenge high enough or strong enough, then they're just going to cakewalk through it. And there's no fun in that if it's a complete blowout. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something to be said for taking a glance between sessions maybe and thinking about what it is you're doing and why you're doing it as a GM, especially if you're going to go diceless, because there's an opportunity to terribly abuse in a diceless. And it's to say, nope,
right.
nope. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah,
as
the players feel powerless, and that just gets frustrating and unfun. And sure.
That's the wrong way to. If you're doing that, you really should be doing a diced system, frankly.
Yeah.
Diceless is really for those who are extremely comfortable as a group sitting around telling the story and consulting the character sheet once in a while as kind of a tiebreaker or a conflict solver.
And now here's an interesting point that this is kind of making me think of. Are we defining right now Diceless as a system without randomization, or a system that has randomization but doesn't use dice?
Oh, excellent point.
Because that's a very important distinction to make. Because I would argue that, for example, our Roll With It system, available now, it's a diceless system because we don't roll dice in it.
That's right.
Yet. And yet we built in the strategic mechanical element of here are the cards in my hand, and they affect the story, but they also affect your chances of succeeding in
Star
scenes.
value.
And there's things that we built into it where if you fail, it boosts the GM in the short term, but boosts you in the long term. You're growing a little bit. If you succeed, maybe you spent a high star value card in order to get over an obstacle the GM set, but the GM now has a high card that they can set as the next obstacle. So we thought through, quite thoroughly how the sort of card economy works and what that means to the sort of trajectory of each episode in the game.
So there is a mechanical value, narrative value, if you will, to a scene and that kind of a thing, and narrative control shifts and those other things do matter. Well, as long as we're talking about cards and numerical values, let's go ahead and bring in some of the systems that use, say, a deck of cards. Now, some have specialty cards and that sort of thing, but let's just assume a traditional deck,
like 52 cards,
52 card
poker deck,
right? Usually what you do is you pull out the jokers, or else they mean something very specific, and then you end up with like Deadlands would be a great example, where you're pulling from the deck. Now, I would argue that let's just take one of the suits, so 13 cards, right? That if you pull out a card and you look at the value, and then you just shuffle the deck back in, you might as well have rolled a D13.
Right.
It's effectively the same thing.
Exactly.
Because what you're talking about is linear probability, just like on our last episode when we talked about that with dice. But whenever you're not shuffling the deck, that particular card, let's say you drew the 10, that 10 is now out of play.
Right. And so that shifts the probability. And this is something that, we talked on our podcast, Backward Compatible, at one point about randomization in games and how to do stuff. And, sometimes you ask the question of, do I want this thing to be truly random, or do I want to be a distributed probability?
And that's the right word
to say
for
that
it.
it's going to happen this many times per 100 times. So this percent of the time this thing happens, and doing a card draw system like that is a way that you can have a distributed probability, where I say if the card is even, for example, it's going to mean that you succeed. And if the card is odd, then you fail. But you also know that as you draw them, the chances of succeeding or failing are going up and down with each one.
That's right.
And you know that across the spectrum, it's always going to be you fail 50% of the times, not dice probability where you are trending toward 50% the more you roll. Because it is possible, however unlikely, that you're going to roll failure. And you have to think about in your game, do I want to allow for consecutive failures just because of bad luck? Or I want it to be more like they're going to fail this many times, but even if they do fail 6 times in a row, that means they're going to succeed the rest of the times because only successes are left.
Yes.
And then, of course, if you don't want players to be able to kind of abuse that, they know like, oh, the only card left is success. I'm going to do something really crazy that should never work, but because the success is coming up, I know it's going to work.
Are you jumping to the moon again?
Yes. But instead of sort of like letting that happen, then the GM can build in, or the system, I should say, the GM or the system, sort of build in or decide that at certain points, maybe determined by something specific, you will reshuffle the deck so that you can't game the system too much, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I don't want to get too distracted by board games, but I think there's an argument to be made that if you really want a crunchy dungeon crawl, there's some brilliant, even scenario-driven board games out there. And I don't just mean like Descent, but I would point to Gloomhaven as a wonderful legacy board game that you could play for a year and be incredibly satisfied as a D&D-like game. That said, there's no dice. it is effectively diceless. And what you're handed is a deck of cards, and the deck of cards you place strategically from your hand. So there's not even a random draw element to it. But once it's played, then you have to do a rest action to get the cards back. And you're discarding one each time you do that. So your hand is getting smaller and smaller. And it's a built-in time limit, and the party has to think together. There's so many wonderful things to it, but no dice.
Mm-hmm.
And I really would love to see that kind of a thing in more RPGs. One of the solutions to that is the idea of a checkbox. And what you have is either some skills or some stats or however it is, and that's that kind of a system. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to do this extraordinary thing where I use a hang glider and let's call it a stunt. I'll steal that word. I'm going to do my stunt, blah, blah. Okay. And the GM's like, great, check off one of your boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Or you've got some of the more unusual ones out there. Like, what's the one that uses the Jenga tower? What's that called?
Dread.
Dread, right.
Fantastic game.
Yeah. Where the only mechanic at all is, okay, you can do that, but I want you to pull one of the sticks or the, what would you call those things?
Blocks.
Yeah. I want you to pull a block. I want you to pull a Jenga block, and you play per normal Jenga rules, where if it falls, you die, and then,
or you're otherwise removed from the game.
You're otherwise removed from the game. And that's the tension. It's wononderful for horror games.
Well, that's what it was designed for.
You do some vampire things or some werewolf things or whatever. And I enjoy some of those Let's Plays. I mean, I've been on the edge of my seat watching some of those Let's Plays, Will Wheaton and those guys doing it. But all of that is to say, there's so many different ways to bring a randomizer in. If your goal is to bring a randomizer in, if your goal is to bring some sort of a governor in, which is a different concept, you may not need dice at all.
Yeah. And that kind of goes back to, we had that episode on roleplay for roleplay, kind of what is the purpose of having a randomizer and what role that plays in the game, what that result is for the gameplay or for the story or for the facilitation between players. And you can do some really creative stuff if you have randomizers other than dice. And, other things to think about is kind of like, what are the properties of what you're using and how that can affect how you're doing things. You might be able to streamline some things or add some more depth to things without making it overly complicated. Just as an example, if you have your deck of poker cards, you draw that and you can say maybe like, okay, you're looking at both sweet and the number, or maybe you're just looking at red versus black and the number or something like that. Or maybe if it's a face card, it's got special properties, that sort of thing.
Sure.
And so like, there's so many ways you can sort of explore the mechanic that you're using. Like when I say mechanic, like, the type of randomizer you're using to do interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely true. So I guess in the simplest form, if I were to give you, say, 10 points, and they're character points, and you could write down any sort of attribute that you wanted to, in thinking in terms of our Doc and Krueger design here, it could be a motif, and you would write down as many motifs as you want. Your max, of course, would be 10, and you could put one point into each. Then those would be the things that you could be good at. And then I would do the same with an NPC character or a PC character or whatever, and then we'd start our story. And anytime you tried to challenge something that might fail, then you'd have to convince me or argue the case that you're going to use these things that you put the points into. You just created a character in a diceless system. And if you can convince me as the GM that, yes, that's appropriate, and that your number adds up to more than my obstacle that I had thinking of or was written down, then yeah, it totally works. So there's a freebie D&K design for you right there off the top of Doc's head. But again, this gets to this idea of potential for abuse. And I think this is one of the reasons why Amber, for example, caused quite a stir. That's an industry quote right there, caused quite a stir. Because everything that came before that was about keeping it fair, keeping it random, keeping it unabusable. You know what I mean? And I think implied in that, and this is where we get a little philosophical, but implied in that is that the players are going to min-max, they're going to exploit, and they're going to cheat. And the GM is going to abuse, He's going to be unfair.
He's going to railroad.
He's going to
Railroad.
Yeah, that too.
Rolled.
Railroad. I like it. And
that's what happens when you get a party wipe because the GM just wanted to give you.
Right. Stay tuned in 2020 for the Doc and Krueger game Railroad. But,
I actually want to make that now.
I do. Right? You heard it here first, folks. All of that is simply to say this. I think that in order to do a diceless system properly, you have to have the right group. Mm-hmm. You have to really have a community spirit on the table. You want to be collaborating and telling a story. And your purpose for being there is very, very different than your purpose for being there to level a character. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. The goal isn't to... The goal is extrinsic rather than intrinsic, perhaps. And now that's not necessarily like 100%.
To the system, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And that's not maybe like 100% of the time accurate statement, but generally speaking, if the goal of the game is to keep winning and leveling up your character and getting loot and becoming more powerful, et cetera, that's different from I'm willing to let my character die because it's good for the story.
Yeah. I'm reminded of our early play test of the Roll With It system, what would become known as. And what's funny is we actually brought up some of the old characters that we'd done before, and they were the characters from Camp Lucky Strike. And so Sergeant Phillips had their moment, and we role played that moment where they were down in the well, and they actually got out of the well, and they commandeered a tank. And it was so much fun, and I still remember that story. And it was because it was this early prototype. There was no star value. There was no mechanics. It was so weird. It felt so weird.
The mechanics were simply prompts.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, I'm going to bring this element into the scene.
Right. It was just a card.
Yeah. It was very sort of like improv-y sort of exercise.
It was too loose, and there wasn't enough there. And
I think the only reason that really succeeded is because we both knew the ending.
Right.
Because what we were playing out was the story of how this happened.
Knew it.
And to be fair, if that's kind of the idea of the game is the ending, how do we get there? Then maybe that would work. But if you're kind of doing what most RPGs do, like probably 99% of the time, which is moving toward an unknown ending, then it might not have worked quite as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think for us, that learning experience was very simple. And it's that, we went too far. There's not enough mechanic. And then that brings us back to where we were after many other play tests, which is the Roll With It system we've just released, which we are incredibly proud of, as a diceless system, which still has fundamentally a mechanic embedded in it, but it's a narrative mechanic per our discussion, a few episodes ago of story-based games. So all of this circles around and back into, why are you using your dice? And if you're not using dice at all, why are you not using your dice?
And how can you play? What are the strengths of not having dice? And how do you design the system or play the game in order to really lean into those strengths?
That's right.
And to let those kind of enhance your experience rather than trying to do something that mechanic wasn't really meant for.
Don't let your role play get in the way of your role play.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're not going to say which one is which.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you did there.
So thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion on going diceless. I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.